hit record. All right, thanks. I appreciate that. Let's get started for our first speaker for the NMSUCCESS. So hello, my name's Dave Dubois. I'm the state climatologist for New Mexico, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's presentation of the New Mexico State University Climate Change Education Seminar Series, or NMSUCCESS. And we've got Dr. Cajete going to be giving a talk, and we have entitled Discussion with Dr. Gregory Cajete on Indigenous Perspectives in Science. Before we get to Dr. Cajete's talk, I have a couple, just a few bits of housekeeping before we get started. Just some news here. So the next event for NMSUCCESS will be at 5:30 p.m. April 7th. So put that on your calendar, and it's titled Solving Climate by 2030. And so we'll hear from a panel of state and local leaders about concrete steps us New Mexicans can take to address climate change in our state. So come to that one. The next item for news is to view and participate in that event. Please register at the NMSU sustainability page. And I think you have that link. It's sustainability.nmsu.edu/NMSUCCESS. And if maybe one of you guys on the team can type that in. The next thing on our news is we appreciate your attendance and continued interest in NMSUCCESS. And please tell your friends about this university-sponsored series, which seeks to inform and challenge us all to address the global crisis of climate change. So after Dr. Cajete's presentation tonight, we'll have a time for question and answers. You can submit questions through the Q&A icon on your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as possible in the time we have left. And so for now, without further ado, I will turn the screen over to my colleague at NMSU, Professor Don Pepion, who has long known Dr. Cajete and will introduce our special guest tonight. So Don, it's all yours.
Okay. Distupicani, Nitanico, Itchimaki. Hello, I am Blackfeet. My name is Stabsdown. My American name is Donald Pepion. I'm a professor here in anthropology. I teach courses in the Native American Studies minors in anthropology. Before we start, I also want to acknowledge that we are on the homelands of Pueblos and Navajos and Apaches and many other descendant groups in this area, and so we want to do that also. So I have known Greg for many years, and we first met at a group meeting of Indigenous scholars that began several years ago. And Greg and the other Indigenous scholars from Canada and Mexico, and it wasn't a big group, would meet annually somewhere, and we would talk about our indigenous knowledge and how it fit with or not with what we know in the Eurocentric or the Western knowledge kind of system. And so many of the things that we talked about that many years ago, I continue to use in my classes. And I do want to thank and acknowledge Dr. Cajete for being an important part of that group. But as far as introductions, the flyer that was sent out really gives a good perspective of Dr. Cajete. But he's currently a professor and director of Native American Studies and Language and Literacy and Social Cultural Studies at the University of New Mexico. He has numerous publications in books and journals. His widely used texts include Look to the Mountain, An Ecology of Indigenous Education. Also, Ignite the Sparkle, an Indigenous Science Education Curriculum Model. Dr. Cajete's book, Native Science, Natural Laws of Interdependence is considered by many as the foundation of scholarly teaching and research at all levels of learning about Native American knowledge. Dr. Cajete is able to maintain the integrity of his Santa Clara Pueblo knowledge while articulating the profound and deep understandings of the Native worldview. Dr. Cajete is a well-known Indigenous scholar. He's in demand in international circles for lectures, conferences, and research. The breadth and depth of his work is weighty. He speaks of an indigenous eco-philosophy, reflecting how Native peoples maintained a connection to the natural world. I think our late New Mexico indigenous philosopher, Viola Cordova, best expressed what Greg's knowledge is about. She said, Native knowledge might sustain us into the future. The challenge is to find a way to live on this earth without wrecking it. I give you Dr. Gregory Cajete. Good to see you, Greg. I'm very honored and pleased to do this. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Don. It was an honor for me to be introduced by you in such an eloquent way. So thank you again for that fine introduction. And hello to the audience. As we say in my language, Sengi Hung, which is good evening. I am from Santa Clara Pueblo. I am actually a retired professor now. I retired from the University of New Mexico this summer. And so I am a independent scholar and consultant, still working quite a bit actually with regard to some of the thoughts and perspectives that I'm going to present to you this evening. So without any further ado, I want to go right into my PowerPoint presentation so that we can have ample time for some kinds of dialogue and discussion with regard to the thoughts and ideas that I'm presenting to you. So my presentation for this evening is entitled Rebuilding Sustainable Indigenous Communities, Applying Native Science. And the first slide that I have in my PowerPoint is kind of iconic for me because, my first degree actually came in biology. I'm trained as a field biologist out of New Mexico, Highlands University. And I had intention actually to go to New Mexico State, to get my graduate degrees in biology. But then on the way to Las Cruces, I stopped off in Santa Fe at the Institute of American Indian Arts and ended up spending 21 years there. And then as I continued my journey, I went from the Institute of American Indian Arts to the University of New Mexico, and I spent 25 years there. So I've taken a long journey in the context of the work I have done in Indigenous education in what I call native science. And the thoughts I'm going to present to you this evening in this PowerPoint really underline some of the perspectives and I think understandings and challenges that Native people face with regard to climate change. But I think it really also should resonate and speak with everyone, particularly those of us that are in New Mexico and are facing, some tremendous challenges already and into the very near future. With regard to water resources, with regard to sustainable farming, food security, all of those kinds of issues, rapidly changing weather patterns that we need to begin to understand and adapt to. So this first slide is actually a picture of a Mimbres plate, and the Mimbres were an indigenous people that lived right in that Las Cruces area into the Gila wilderness area about 1,200 years ago. And they were a very vibrant culture. We know that because of the many ruins, the many communities that they left, as evidence of their habitation of that part of New Mexico. But their most outstanding representation of themselves came in the form of their pottery. They're very distinct, membranous, black and white or positive negative images. And so this particular plate for me is kind of iconic because, as an artist, I should say that I'm a self-trained artist as well. And I've done art and been involved with arts, throughout my career. Being a self-taught artist, this particular piece speaks volumes because, as you can see, it's the sandhill crane, and then there's a human effigy figure. And it's not two images, it's one image, which simply means that you can't pull the two images apart without destroying the entire composition. And I think there's an iconic metaphoric meaning in that, because in this particular representation, the sandhill crane is the human effigy. The human effigy is the sandhill crane. You can't pull them apart. They're a positive, negative image. They're surrounded by designs that represent the forces of nature, the four directions, and very iconically represent the ethos and the perspective of the members as an indigenous people, as an indigenous people with a philosophy of relationality, relationship to each other in community, and also relationship to the natural world around them, which they gave life to and which gave life to them. And so I use that in many of my presentations to represent the ideas and perspectives that I want to bring forward. Indigenous peoples and climate change. Indigenous peoples are like the miner's canary. When their cultures and languages disappear, this reflects the profound sickness in the ecology. And this comes from work by Paul Havman and Helen Wall, who wrote about Indigenous people and climate change. In North America, climate change has already drastically affected Indigenous peoples. Hunting and fishing, economic infrastructure, water and housing availability, forest and agricultural resources, and even their health and well-being. And this continues and actually is accelerating in many ways. I think that what is important to really remember is that Indigenous peoples are very much like in the human community, in the human ecology, are very, very much like the diversity of plants and animals that one finds in an ecosystem. And we know as ecologists that the greater diversity you have in an ecosystem, the greater health and resilience is reflected by that ecosystem. And so as Indigenous peoples, Indigenous languages, essentially for all intents and purposes become extinct, the diversity of the human ecology is also being directly affected by their loss. So Indigenous meetings actually have been going on for quite some time, actually for the last 30 years. I know I say meeting for the past 20 years in this slide, but that was 10 years ago. It's really about 30 years that we've been meeting. And Indigenous peoples have been discussing, documenting changes using their traditional environmental knowledge, their experience, and have been describing the same kinds of drastic shifts that scientists now recognize as occurring. The scale of the change will present severe challenges to all tribal cultures, resources, and well-being. And so long before I think it became, a part of the popular news bites, Indigenous people were very concerned about climate change and how it was impacting their lands and themselves. Climate changes now. In the far north, you have melting sea ice, glaciers, and permafrost, an increase in fires, insects, flooding, and drought patterns. Here in the Southwest, we have drought and insect infestations, unpredictable seasons, and the rise of the possible rise of such virus infestations as we've had in the past, such as hantavirus. In the global sphere, one could also include the coronavirus epidemic as a part of this kind of expression, this kind of effect or impact of climate change. In the Great Plains, we have extreme weather, flooding, blizzards, tornadoes, and drought, some of which have just passed through last week, and we're expecting a few more, particularly in the plains this coming week. In the east, you have ice storms, flooding, and rapid ice flows. And this is just some examples of some of the kinds of things that are happening today. And in many ways, Indigenous people have more at stake in all of these events because climate change significantly affects cultural ways of life and place-based rights. Indigenous philosophy, Indigenous science, essentially is what would be called a place-based science. It's very specific, very unique to tribes and places that those tribes live in. And that's why it is impacted immediately by changes in climate that happen in places. Other examples are species and treaty boundaries are directly affected because they are based on place. Loss of traditional knowledge because of the loss of key plants, animals, and also a context, habitats. Where these forms of knowledge reside. And then, of course, among coastal tribes, they are being impacted by sea rise and actually all of the same kinds of things that other indigenous tribes are being affected by. Now, I have to really emphasize that I'm talking mostly about the United States, somewhat about Canada, but actually the indigenous world is much larger than that. And so if you can sort of expand your thinking with regard to these kinds of issues as being a global phenomenon for indigenous peoples, with some indigenous peoples really faring much worse than even I am describing now. For us as indigenous people, sustaining our communities is essential. Community is the bedrock of indigenous culture and tradition. Things like ensuring fresh water supplies, secure food supplies, meeting the impact of key plant and animal species requires our attention to practice forms of community. It requires our reforming of traditional eco-knowledge, which many tribes are very much engaged in at the present moment. And also to exercise our tribal sovereignty with regard to these issues and with regard to land rights and uses of our lands and our resources. It also requires that we plan locally, cooperate with other tribes, institute specific educational programs, work with NGOs and other government agencies, through collaboration and mutual action with regard to climate change within regions. And this is what many tribes are beginning to do extensively. All of this really requires, from my perspective, a serious recreating of community, a sense of community, and also a form of practiced community. This requires an education process of gathering and sharing information, which for Native people is formal research. A application of treaties and agreements to protect these key habitats that are important to the diversity and to the eco-health of these areas, these regions. For many of the tribes, it's also the development of renewable energy and food sources. And then, of course, across the board, it's about engaging youth and their participation globally. So these are some of the kinds of serious, strategies that are at play, within the indigenous world, worldwide, with regard to some of the addressing some of the impacts of climate change. I had the opportunity to work with two colleagues in Santa Fe. Santa Fe at one time had a Center for a Community, and it was run by Cheryl Charles and Bob Samples. They wrote a book called Coming Home. And in that, they talk about, what is a healthy community? And I use their work because I think it is so poignant for our time and the kinds of situations that we are now facing with climate change. So they said that healthy communities are cultural and natural systems where life and learning are nourished by actions of the members. This enables peaceful and sustainable futures. We begin with one core community, but become members of many other kinds of community throughout our lifetime. And I might interject at this point, the reason why community could become so important, as a focus of sustainability is because the issues of climate change are such that no individual, no one organization really can address the multiple and very complex issues of climate change by themselves. It requires a sense of community, a sense of the community good, and a sense of working in community through community. So Indigenous knowledge follows very much within that communal realm because, as I said, community is the foundation of the sustainability of Indigenous communities and has been throughout their history. The places in which we live, our homelands. This is the reason why Native people have fought so tenaciously to maintain their land base, because it was life and it meant the life of their culture and their families and their generations to come. So in that context, Indigenous knowledge comes in four directions, as I would call them. There is, of course, traditional knowledge handed down based on stories and experiences of a people through time. There's empirical knowledge gained through careful observation and practice over time. There's revealed knowledge gained through vision, through ritual and ceremony. And then there's contemporary knowledge, which is something I've just added, which is gained through experience and problem solving. And contemporary knowledge also includes contemporary education, contemporary participation in governance, and all of these kind of modern institutions that Indigenous people are now engaging in with regard to a new form of knowledge that they've learned and begun to practice within their communities and within the context of addressing climate change. One of the things that, when you study Indigenous cultures, one of the things that becomes immediately apparent is the fact that while Indigenous peoples are very diverse, throughout the globe, even here in the United States and even here in the Southwest, that there's a great diversity with regard to language, customs, traditions that Native people hold. But what really allows us to, in a sense, communicate across our cultures, across our diversity, is that we all kind of operate from the same plan book, from the same worldview, which is essentially a relational worldview. And I think is best coined in the Lakota form, saying that we are all related, or as the Pueblos that I come from, we are all kernels on the same corn cob. And when those metaphors are evoked, it brings your mind to the understanding that Indigenous cultures essentially still operate from a foundation of metaphors of life. In the sense, biological metaphors are alive, they're life-centered. as opposed to mechanical metaphors, which are essentially not alive. So the metaphor becomes the metaphor you live by, the metaphor you build your worldview around very much matters. And we're beginning to see that in so uncertain terms, so stark comparisons between life-related metaphors and mechanical metaphors today. So metaphors influence the way we think and the ways in which we affect others. Today, there's a compelling need for people everywhere throughout the globe. People are searching for meaning. Many, not all, but many lack a sense of communal good. And we struggle without recognizing the need for this communal virtue and this ethical action. A healthy society can only come from healthy communities comprised of self-determining individuals, acting and taking responsibility for their actions for all. So this idea of community, of ecological connection, is embedded in indigenous philosophies and expressed by different tribes historically in their own ways. I like this particular metaphor, this particular definition. It comes from a book by D. Hawk. The book is called Birth of the Cardotic Age. And in that, he defines community the following. He says, the essence of community, its very heart and soul, is the non-monetary exchange of value. I want to emphasize non-monetary exchange of value. It's about the things we do and share because we care for others and for the good of the place. It arises from a deep, intuitive, and often subconscious understanding that self-interest is inseparably connected with community interest. Now, when I read that, many years ago, I said, that's the indigenous essence of how we understand as indigenous people what community is really about. Community is not a material thing. Community is I would call it a kind of an essence, a spirit that is deeply embedded in all of us as human beings. And I think D. Hawk really captured it in that context, comparing it to, in the sense, this non-monetary exchange of value, which predominates how we view each other and how we view our society and how we view the environment today. So community is a lot of work. It just doesn't happen. In the modern world, particularly in the United States, individualism is taught, is rendered, is reflected on. It's inculated in our education systems. So individualism reigns large. Community, on the other hand, is something that actually does require work and conscious work at that. It brings to us a perception of belonging that supports our sense of identity, of who we are. It places our identity in context. It requires participation and commitment. The support of individuals, it requires the support of individuals, but in turn, it supports individuals. And there's a synergy through which it attains coherence, and that's kind of a indigenous science metaphor, which it simply means that when you are in community, when you are participating in community, you feel it deep down into your very soul, if you will. And so the community requires a lot. It requires conscious effort. And of course, community for indigenous people was not only, human community relationship to each other in our extended families and clans within tribes, within tribal groups, but it was also relationship to the natural world, the places which gave us life, the plants, the animals, the entities. And so many tribes, I think, basically I can say almost really without doubt, all tribes had what we would call world renewal ceremonies, ceremonies that brought together people to remember that they were part of not only a human community, but a much larger ecological community that gave them life and that they were very importantly responsible for, and that needed to be respected. So this first slide gives you a sense of, it comes from a storybook about the first salmon ceremonies, which are now again being performed by many of the Northwest Indian tribes. And it's just a complex of different kinds of ceremonies and gatherings and songs and dances that are performed during really very soon, this time of year when the salmon return to spawn once again in the lakes and in the streams in the Northwest from which they came. And this idea of continuity of resource and respect for resource is an integral part of Indigenous thought. This other slide, this is the cover of the 1992 National Geographic. It is the October issue, and it is entitled 1491. And the slide I really enjoy because I think it sort of embodies what I would call a kind of spiritual ecology that was known and understood, by all tribes in their own ways. And I think this art has really captured that kind of consciousness, that indigenous consciousness as it relates to relationship in an environment. So part of the work I've done really over my career has been to try to bring forward this story and to really challenge ourselves to begin to look at how we recreate Indigenous education and informs, because Indigenous education formed the foundation along with community and within community that reinforce the development of this consciousness, this ecological consciousness among various tribes. And I think this is the kind of education that we must now begin to rekindle and recreate within modern times, within contemporary education. So that requires teaching and learning, which is transformative and anticipates change and innovation. Indigenous education can also integrate and apply principles of sustainability along with appropriate traditional environmental knowledge. Indigenous education, Indigenous philosophy, Indigenous worldview, however you want to term it, is inherently a sustainable way of thinking. It evokes, it relies on, it produces a sustainable consciousness. And that is something that in many ways we need today, and we have to begin to explore ways to bring that forward into our time, into our place. So Indigenous education forms a foundation for community renewal and revitalization. And so for Indigenous peoples, the reformation of Indigenous education based on these precepts, these understandings of Indigenous thought become very, very important. This brings us to this notion of relationship and relatedness. Again, the Lakota phrase, we are all related, we are all related. We are all members of Turtle Island. And this representation of the great turtle, which is a representation of the Earth Mother, and various Indigenous people who ride her back, I think is an iconic metaphor, structural metaphor, a sculpture, if you will, that represents that idea. one of the hardest things that we have to do, all of us, is to actually honestly look at our own complicity in the current circumstances that we are facing. And I mean, really at all levels. As concerned people, we have to take a long, hard, and honest look at our current educational, economic, governmental, political, certainly, and community development policies and planning processes, which many times make us complicit with the status quo, complicit with the problems, the very challenges that we're trying now to address. And so, as I say, this is the work of all of us in the context of whatever profession, whatever institution, whatever political ideology you may profess, that we must really take a very direct and correct and honest look at our own complicity. Getting back to human communities, they give us a sense of purpose. The communities are based on a sense of core values. As I said before, participation, community, commitment, collaboration, and trust are what are required, to maintain the glue of community. Communities are conscious choice for most people, but they also entail a shared responsibility. They include acceptance, accountability, respect, reciprocity, and again, accountability. I think I was really on that shtick, doubled community, doubled accountability and community. But I think that's probably during the past year when I was mulling over our current political situation in this country and actually around the globe. And also efficacy, which is really effectiveness, the ability of a community to be effective in terms of what it does. So that brings us to that other question that I talked about earlier, the inherent nature of Indigenous community as having inherently a sustainable foundation. And really, as I talked with Indigenous peoples, some of the things that I think are very important for Indigenous peoples around the globe is that we educate for recreation of cultural economies around Indigenous paradigms. And some of this is already happening in various parts of the world. Indigenous communities and Indigenous enterprises are beginning to evolve and emerge, to sustain people and land. You begin by learning the history and the principles of your Indigenous way of sustainability, and then explore ways to translate that into the present. And then research the practical ways to apply these Indigenous principles and knowledge bases. So when I'm talking to an Indigenous group, as I often do, these are the recommendations, if you will. These are the points of advice that I give to Indigenous communities. But I know that we have a mixed audience and that we have both Indigenous and non-Indigenous in this particular webinar. So I would say this is equally applicable to non-Indigenous populations as we begin to sort of reform our ways of community, our ways of education around sustainable areas of focus. And so the same principles apply, if you're in an Indigenous context. One of the kinds of things I tried to do when I was at the University of New Mexico is to bring in a new kind of Native education predicated on guiding Native students towards a vision of health, renewed, revitalized, sustainable, and economically viable communities, because these are the kinds of needs, the kinds of important understandings and perspectives, kinds of skills that many Indigenous people need today. And to some extent, I was successful at the University of New Mexico in helping to form curriculum around these goals, these needs, these aims. And hopefully that will continue, even though I'm now retired, into the future. So what do you do, if you're looking at a revitalization of Indigenous sustainability and an Indigenous person? And what do you do if you're a non-Indigenous person that wants to begin to explore how to create more sustainable communities, healthy communities? Well, first, you begin with a sense of ecological integrity. Start from the premise that what you do has integrity and honors life-giving relationship. Remember that Indigenous philosophies are, by a whole, because they're based on relatedness, they're life-centered philosophies. Build in a sustainable orientation, which sustains the community, the culture, and the place. Have a vision and purpose. See what you do in the light of revitalization of community. And I think if you study the histories of Puebloan peoples here in the Southwest, you'll see that some of these precepts that I'm pulling forward, from the past, actually still do apply today in new configurations, of course, in new expressions, but are, I think, very important, in terms of consideration. For Indigenous people, spiritual purpose is important. And that includes cultural integrations, actions which originate through spiritual agency that stem from connection to a cultural way of life and being. And I think Pueblos here, the tribes here, many tribes, in the United States are reflecting this spiritual agency in ways that are important to them and are appropriate for them. Respect for all. Actions stem from respect for and celebration of community. We're always remember that we are part of a community as Native people. And so we have all kinds of celebration that evoke community, that include community, that build on community, that perpetuate community. Many of our ceremonies are actually about just that. Engaging the participation of community is becoming very important because the community is both the medium and the beneficiary of the activities of sustainable processes, sustainable economics, sustainable governance, sustainable actions. This whole notion of relationship has to be revisited in a very, very real and direct way. But part of our issues with climate change have resulted from a disconnection from the natural world and from a breaking of a covenant and a relationship that we once had, worldwide with our environments, with the places that gave us life. And so this whole notion of relationality becomes both a philosophical as well as a practical question. So build upon and extend relationships that are essential to this process of development. Restore and extend the health of the community is a key goal. Any initiative should generate dynamic and creative processes. And then finally, in looking at what is required, I can't underscore enough the notion of commitment. Commitment to developing the necessary skills, commitment to community renewal and its revitalization, and commitment to mutual reciprocal action and transformation. So these are the categories of commitment, where commitment unpacks itself, so to speak, in this process of sustainable development. For Indigenous peoples, we are working on a variety of different kinds of ideas. Worldwide, you find Essentially, if you look at an indigenous community, you can say that it is a part of a complex adaptive ecological system. And the knowledge that emerges from the experiences of people within that system is what we call ecological knowledge. It came about as a result of resourcefulness and industriousness through collaboration and cooperation, through the ability to integrate difference in political organization, through building alliances and confederations, through trade and exchange. And so these are themes that are important, I think, to rediscover, reinitiate, revisit, revitalize within the context of indigenous sustainability. There are lots of challenges. As many indigenous leaders will tell you, establishing political self-determination is not an easy thing. Decolonization and culturally responsive education is an ongoing task needed at every level. There, of course, are issues of economic exploitation, diverse competing ideologies, political restructuring that hamper any sorts of progress. This also includes our own individual diversities, redefining our definition of ourselves as we live as we go on our journey through life, and creating formal and informal institutions that actually espouse and teach for this kind of sustainability. I use the Hopi farmer who's tilling his corn because that represents, I think, some of the ways in which indigenous people in the past were able to apply some of these ideas that I'm bringing forward to you. Other challenges, of course, are cultural, social, political, and spiritual fragmentation, creation of formal and informal institutions which advance sustainability, flowing with heterogeneity, complexity, and differentiation, which is constantly evolving, and then also doing the political restructuring when necessary. This time of the year, many of the pueblos are getting their fields ready for planting, and this is an old farmer right here in Sandia Pueblo who's preparing his field, getting ready for planting. And in a lot of ways, that's what we're doing, and that's what I'm doing, in the context of even this presentation. Again, I want to remind you that while I'm focusing on indigenous kinds of contexts, that many of the things I'm saying actually apply to a much broader community context. So we do have a few things that we can work with as indigenous people, our extended family, clan, and tribal system, the place in which we live, the community. We have political, social, trade organizations, co-ops, federations. And I get in trouble for this one, but I'll say it anyway. Even the corporation can be sustainable if founded on principles of sustainability, and also founded on that definition of DHOC, which is the value lies not in the monetary value, but in what you do for others in the context. Because corporation is actually a synonym that comes from community. It's a kind of organizational community. But the issue may be the way that it's structured around a certain viewpoint, a certain worldview. So, what we are all trying to do is sustain ourselves, and this is going to become extremely difficult in the years to come. As all of these kinds of forces are coming together to form some real challenges, to making the changes that we need for climate change. So for me, some of the things in focus that I've done in the past have included indigenous food traditions, the nature of indigenous family and community, Indigenous relationship, Indigenous health, Indigenous education. I should add also to that Indigenous art, because art is a healing process and very important, very an integral part of the process of sustainability that I've just mentioned. And so here are some of our New Mexico traditional foods: the pinon, the chilies, the nopal cactus, and corn. So ultimately, it comes down to this. We find ourselves in this globally climate changed world, rapidly understanding that we are actually all kernels in the same basket, which is a Pueblo saying, that we use sometimes. We're all in the same basket, and we're all part of, the earth and the earth systems, and we have to begin to think and act in those terms now and especially in the future. So I hope what I've given you in terms of and I use the metaphor of food because that's what I've also been talking about. I've given you some food for thought, with regard to how you view and how you understand sustainability, some of the challenges that are being faced, what Indigenous people are doing, what our notions of sustainability are. And hopefully that will give you some insight and some inspiration into the kinds of things that are happening now with global climate change, sustainability, Indigenous communities, and health, all of which are tied together in this ecosystem. And we have to begin to think in those eco terms, those system terms, those community terms. And I guess, here in New Mexico, we are actually doing a lot. We are actually, outside of our institutions, we are doing many things, that are bringing forward some of these precepts, these ideas in all our communities. We are looking more closely at, food and sustainability and food, all of the kinds of things that are important, I think, to begin to actually implement and affect, the transformations that are needed. I'm hoping our institutions become more active than they currently are, although I know that both New Mexico State and the University of New Mexico are doing research and are doing, many professors and many graduate students are doing excellent research, in terms of sustainability. But I think, as you look at the horizon of the timetables that we're having to work with, I think all of us have to up our game in the sense that, we need immediate solutions, immediate actions, that are long overdue. And hopefully we'll begin to develop those initiatives very quickly. So again, as we say again, among my people, the Tewa, Wikunda, thank you so much, for your time and for your sharing of your breath of life, as we would say. And again, Wikunda. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and let our moderator come back in and begin to field some questions for us. Dave, you're on.
All right. All right. Thank you, Greg. I much appreciated. I wish we were here in person. We can give you thank you with our hands, but I think we can all do that and online. All 109 of us that are on the we've got the way to do that virtually. If you know how to do that, go ahead and do that. But this is great. I really thank you for all those words of encouragement. I think there's a lot of opportunities we can really take to heart and be more active and being more sustainable for those who are Indigenous and not. So we've got a bunch of questions here, and let me just go for the first one here. And the first one is the question was, isn't climate change more accurately described as climate disruption, as human had disrupted the climate change happens all the time. It was Dick Cheney who ordered the EPA that global warming be changed to climate change from Carlos. So do you have any response to that question?
Well, I think there's a certain amount of truth to that statement. Yes, ecosystems are dynamic. They're in constant change, and have been, throughout Earth's history. I think the idea of it's not that we don't know that climate changes, is that the climate cycles that are spurred on by natural processes within the Earth have been interrupted in very significant ways by human action. And I think that is a good way to begin to think about, climate. That it is indeed a disruption of a natural cycle, and we're paying the consequences, of that disruption in no uncertain terms. And so I agree with the person who posed that question, is that is probably a better term, although the term climate change is now the political term, unfortunately, that we deal with, in terms of the language.
Do you know of is there a Tiwa name? How would you explain climate change?
Well, that's a good question. I would say that the explanation I gave, that we know that that climate changes, and it changes dynamically, but I don't know that we call the changes that happen by the forces like wind. We just had a windstorm here last night that was pretty intense, and we call that iwan. It's very unstable, very heavy wind, that comes, but that's a good question. I don't know that we've invented a term for climate change. And maybe we'll go to our linguists and begin to throw some terms around, some native terms for that. I'm sure that some tribes do actually have terms for this. So maybe Don might remember something, if he's still on the webinar, for that question. But that would be my response.
Okay, great, thanks.
I just think. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Greg asked me something, and just to remind people that there's the time and place is a different conception, and there's the world changes, but it changes in patterns, and we are living in that world at the same time with everything. And so that's the idea of us being all related, and then the language, it's really in the here and now. We are living with change as it happens, but change with those patterns. So as far as terminology, I can't think of one exact word, but we say tsitike tsitapi. What it means to be Pakani is to live in the world and live with all our relatives while everything is moving and going on. So that's my addition, Greg. Thanks.
Okay, that's good. It's a good addition. Absolutely. I'll remember that one.
All right.
It's living with the flow. It's called living with the flow. Living in the moment and living with the flow.
Yeah, you and Leroy Little Bear talk about it. That's where I got it.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that. Yeah.
Okay. We got another question. So the question is, do you think the appointment of Deb Holland, a member of the Laguna Pueblo, who participated in protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline, will elevate and incorporate Indigenous values and knowledge into land management policies and core values of this nation?
I think she will do exactly that. I don't know at this point. I can't predict how much opposition there is to some of the kinds of initiatives that she's going to attempt to implement. But I certainly know that she will bring forward an Indigenous consciousness to many of the policies and many of the kinds of actions that she will take as Secretary of Interior. She does come from Laguna and Jemez Pueblos, which are pueblos up in my area here around Rio Rancho here and Santa Clara. So I know that she has experienced the Pueblo community life, but she's also a lawyer who has and also an activist who has participated and has worked with and done scholarship with regard to environmental justice issues, not only here in the Southwest but also nationwide. So there's probably no more competent person to head the Department of Interior at this point. And certainly her indigeneity and her understanding experience is going to facilitate a lot of the things that she will do. So I'm hoping that she will be able to accomplish a lot. Again, one can never tell with the kinds of political oppositions that are in play right now, and economic as well.
Okay, another question that we got from the audience, and it's thank you, Dr. Cajete, for your breath of life. It is invigorating and appreciated. So the question is, could you offer more of your thoughts on the relationship between indigenously empirical knowledge and Westernized contemporary knowledge? And this is from Brad.
Well, okay, Brad. I think I would look at the question this way: that we as human beings, we have a certain kind of makeup, in our brains that where we look at things, we listen to things, we manipulate things. So we have a cognitive process that is common to all of us as human beings. And certainly native scientists, let's say, have applied that. You look at places like Chaco Canyon, or look at traditional forms of agriculture, look at, the canals there in Tucson and Phoenix area. You look at the pyramids in Mexico, and that indigenous scientists, were applying some of the same basic principles using the tools they had at hand at that time, to do the kinds of work that they did, So indigenous science at a practical level is very practical. It looks for solutions to problems that are important to address within the context of a community or within the context of a region. And if you look at the history of indigenous science as applied by indigenous peoples, you'll see that that's the case. The difference comes in the context of the worldview, because the operating assumptions that indigenous science works by is that we're all related, that we are connected to a larger life system, that we have relationship and responsibility. The question that indigenous science would ask is, how am I related to this? In Western science, the question is, what is this and how does it work? This brings forward that indigenous science, while it parallels Western science in terms of faculties that are used. Western science, of course, has begun to rely on technologies that are invented, that are created, for certain particular special purposes. Whereas native science really has continued to work with and is continuing to work with human faculties and developing those faculties in a much more comprehensive way, I think. And in ways, that's why spirituality becomes a very important part of the practice and application of indigenous science. And so you can see this difference in places like Chaco Canyon, which are, by any means or measure, for the time, were just architectural genius. But the purpose for those structures in Chaco Canyon was to align the people with the natural order of the sun and the moon, and to be able to time those events, those special events, in such a way that the people could resonate, could actually, make a deep connection to those natural processes as they were happening. And so the purpose for Chaco Canyon was very much about developing in a deeper way that relationship that I talked about, that resonance with the natural order. And so that is the goal of indigenous science, historically. And then there's, of course, there's a spirituality and a purpose and a vision, and also a practical outcome of that, which is, in the form of the ruins that you find of Chaco Canyon. But the real reason they built it was for that purpose of a deeper relationship with the cosmic order. And that's the difference between the two. And I think that's also what we will call an intractable conflict that indigenous thinking may have with Western thinking in science. But I think that Western science is beginning to come around to those same kind of points of view. Certainly that's happening, I think, in the way that quantum physics is being described by Western scientists. And I think also in terms of ecology, ecological philosophy, and practices in ecology, that some of those same intents and perspectives are being echoed in the work of contemporary scientists. But still, that worldview is a major conflict. The differences in worldview, as I call it, it's an intractable conflict. So how we solve that may also be the foundation for how we begin to solve climate change long-term, or climate disruption, as the new term has been coined.
Okay, got another question, a scholarly question is, which scientific journals would you recommend to publish indigenous science work, and one that will not make you compromise your core values and worldview within your research? And this is from Andrea.
Well, Andrea, that's a that's a question that really cuts to the chase. And at this point, I haven't found any. I recently tried to publish an article. I won't tell you the journal, but in my own terms, and it was just totally rejected. And so I know that there's that systemic, that difference in worldview, okay, plays out in so many different ways in our institutions, in our academic journals, and in real life. So not finding really a journal that is that open, although I know that a lot of journals are now trying to be very open to indigenous thought, indigenous scholarship, but it still has to be in Western terms. And that's a negotiating point that tends to stagnate a lot of real creative work and a lot of indigenous people submitting to academic journals. So that being said, they are indigenous journals that are now and have been rising, that are publishing indigenous articles from the indigenous perspective in the indigenous voice. And I think that that trend is going to continue because there is a big difference in terms of this, the way that we write, the way that we express ourselves, and the way academe wants us to express ourselves. And this happens with my graduate students. This happened with me. It continues to happen with me. It happens with many other indigenous scholars. And it's a systemic bias that really, I think, has to be seriously addressed by the institutions and by the academy itself.
Thank you. Another question. So what does culturally responsive education look like for a non-Indigenous instructor aiming to ally with decolonization efforts? And do we aim and engage pre-colonial indigenously allied cultural aspects? And how do we overcome obstacles that situate whiteness and European ancestry as inherently destructive of Earth, inherently competitive, inherently based on scarcity? What advice would you offer for a pre-colonial European seeking answers to these questions? And that's from Brad.
Well, Brad, that's really a very deep question, and thank you for it. Certainly, I also write about how you create culturally responsive curriculum. And this is a question that many times comes up from many teachers that are taking courses or modules from me. Really, it comes down to creation and really an openness to explore not only the real history of Western civilization and colonization, and also the history of Western science in this regard, but to also include and find ways to include the science traditions of not only indigenous cultures, but cultures from around the world, because all cultural traditions have forms of science that they have had and applied historically. And I think that comes to the diversity of the way that different cultures through time have expressed their forms of science. And I think that's an important history that generally is not taught unless you're actually researching it as a researcher. You're not going to really look at those histories. But I think bringing forward that story and those stories, bringing forward those histories, and including, in a very direct and honest way, Western civilization, because there have also been, huge accomplishments, and that cannot be denied in the context of Western science, in the context of Western civilization. But I think what has happened is that has been so overemphasized to the exclusion of other cultural voices in science, that part of the notion is really to bring balance to that first, in the teaching of science, in the explanations of science, in the construction of science. And I think that's also a part of the transformation that has to take place as we begin to address climate change, climate disruption. But I do courses. It's not something that one can answer, one size fits all. It's actually it's individual teachers creating based on their experience, based on their scholarship, bringing together the components in a curriculum model that I've designed that helps them to understand how to teach science in a culturally responsive way.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question is, as a non-native, I see that culture is soaked in human supremacy. So how do we communicate and strengthen a relationship with other forms of life, such as animals, plants, minerals, and mycelium? It's from Ray.
Well, that's a good question. I think I think we really have to, deep down in ourselves as human beings and really, really celebrate our relationships to animals. Once again, I know that pet owners and people with pets, have an intimate and very human relationship with their animal. Their animal spirits, so to speak, the pets that they have, and it's that foundation that you can actually build from in terms of having empathy for other living things, plants and animals. And I think those are the things that we have to begin to really recognize and rekindle within ourselves, because I think animals naturally relate to human beings if we have a authentic connection, soul to soul, so to speak. And I think, and I use the example of pets, as being one example of human to animal connection and relationship. If we could extend that same empathy, to other animals, other beings in the natural world, we would begin to develop or redevelop, that own propensity within ourselves. This is called in biology biophilia, the biophilic instinct that we all carry with us, which is an affiliation with other living things. And we have it it's said to be a very deep instinct within us. Some of the work of some of our scientists, have really reflected on, that sentient connection. For Native people, we remember that relationship. We acknowledge that relationship. We honor that relationship, through the dances that we perform, the songs that we sing, the art that we create, and the the kinds of ceremonies that we perform. So that is our way as Indigenous people, that we remember our relationships that have given us life, and that we are connected to within a place. So I think that, developing those kinds of mechanisms within a context of community and also individually are what bring forward that biophilic sensibility that E.O. Wilson talks about in many of his writings, about human-animal relationship.
Great. We got so many questions. We won't be able to answer all of them. So I appreciate those who submitted their questions. So before we end, do you have any other last thoughts you would like to provide to the audience? And we still have 85 on the Zoom call. I'll give you another minute or so to say something.
No, I just want to really emphasize that we're all at a precipice of time. That we are facing tremendous challenges. Everywhere. Socially, politically, economically, and especially ecologically. And that it's going to really take all of us and really our heartfelt commitment to do the work that we can to reestablish, a meaningful and sustainable relationship with our environment and also with each other. I've always said that in education, there's three quintessential issues that we have that challenge us, that we have to deal with in a very direct and very deep way. And the first, and they're all about relationship, incidentally. They're all about relationship. The first one is our relationship to each other, which is the social relationship. Our relationship to each other, community, across cultures, across races. The next one is really our relationship to the environment, our animals, to its lands, its waters. And the third one is our relationship to our own spiritual self and also to the spirit that moves all things, which, you know, we call by various names, but it's that animating spirit, you know, that seems to be present but invisible, but nonetheless very powerful and profound in terms of its impact on our lives. So it's all about relationship and reestablishing that relationship in a deeper and meaningful way at both the individual and communal and societal level, global level. So that's what I would leave us with, you know. Hopefully we can begin to teach, to learn, to do scholarship, you know, towards that end, because we need to really, really begin to address these issues in a very direct and real way. And our institutions have to be willing to change, including our universities, I might add, all of our universities, and all of our ways of understanding, you know, ourselves, you know, in this very important time. So again, I would say, you know, as we say, be with life, you know. Be with life, you know, be focused on life-centered, sustaining, nourishing relationship.
All right. Okay. Thank you. That's about, I think we'll wrap it up at this point. And if you haven't got dinner, now's the time to get it. Thanks again to Dr. Cajete, and thanks again to Don Pepion and members of the series steering committee. Thank you. And we hope to see you again on our next event. Remember, that's on April 7th at 5:30 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, and called Solving Climate by 2030. Again, thank you again, Dr. Cajete, and good night to all. So long, guys.
Bye.